So thanks for everybody who just joined in, either on Zoom or on Facebook. I'm sure it will take a few more minutes until we'll have everybody on board. I'm very excited that all of us are here with us today in a very interesting topics. I think a little bit even surprising topic that caused a lot of debates, by the way, also inside Alma Center and between me and the nice panelists and professional panelists that are with us today. So good evening, everybody. I'm Sarit Zahavi, the CEO of Alma Research and Education Centers. Thank you so much for joining us today. Alma Center is a non-profit organization that focuses on Israel's security challenges on the northern border. You're, of course, all invited to enter our website, Israel-Alma.org, and to learn more about what we do and research that we have developed greatly in the past months of the COVID-19. We actually had an opportunity to do that. We provide information for policymakers and opinion makers across the world, information that deals with Hezbollah, Lebanon, Syria, and the Iranian influence in the region. All of us live in the region, so we take it very personally, everything that is going on over here. Of course, when we deal with I don't want to call it peace process, but negotiations between us and our neighbors. We are coming live from Tefen today and with our brand new monthly webinar. And it really inspires me to see so many views on this video. So thank you everybody for helping our community grow and for being part of what we do. As you know, since the COVID-19, we cannot have any more border tours. Me and Miri used to do that almost daily, but now things have changed. So meanwhile, we are bringing Israel's northern border to you. And of course, during the webinar, if you have more questions, you're invited to write in the Q&A section in the bottom of your screen, and we will address those at the end of the interview. So now to the hot topic of the month, the opening of the negotiations of the maritime border between Israel and Lebanon, trying to eventually settle the dispute between both these countries. Ibrahim, if you can just put the nice maritime map, I would be grateful. There were a lot of speculations about this issue, whether it's the beginning of a normalization process, whether this is a peace process. What exactly is these negotiations? And now you can see the map. You can see what does that mean. The triangular in blue in the middle is actually the area of dispute, an area which goes up to about 200 miles from the seashore. And of course, what is interesting is the fact that we have over here a lot of potential to gas reservoir in the region from both sides, the Israeli and the Lebanese side. Thank you, Ibrahim. You can now end the share screen. And 1 minute, I lost you. So when we are looking at these questions of what exactly these negotiations are, we look at Hezbollah that on the one hand made it very, very clear that it is just negotiation about the maritime border. It has nothing to do with any peace with the Zionist entity or the Zionist enemy that is still in Palestine. I'm now quoting from Hezbollah speakers. On the other hand, we have seen some Lebanese reporters that claim that there is an opportunity over here. So the words peace, normalizations are already on the table while people are addressing this. What exactly is this maritime dispute? What does that mean when we talk about these negotiations? In order to answer all of these interesting questions, we have two really professionals that I highly evaluate and I really love. First Colonel Miri Eisin, who serves on the faculty of the Interdisciplinary Center, the IDC in Herzliya in Israel, where she teaches graduate and undergraduate students and is an associate at the International Institute for Counterterrorism. Eisin has a deep background in intelligence, security, and diplomacy. She is also a member of Alma's International Advisory Board. I'm so happy. During her 20 years in the Israel Defense Forces, she served as the intelligence officer in combat units, personal assistant to the director of military intelligence, and deputy head of combat intelligence corps. Eisin is among the first women to achieve the rank of colonel in the IDF. After retiring from the military, Eisin served as the Israeli government spokesperson during the Second Lebanon War in 2006, as an international press secretary to Prime Minister Ehud Olmert during the Annapolis peace process in 2007. So Miri, I'm so happy that you are with us today.
A real pleasure.
Also with us today is Brigadier General Ram Yavne. Served in the IDF for 32 years. He served as the head of the strategic division in the planning directorate of the IDF General Staff, J5. That's the, I don't know the name, from 2015 to 2018. In his position, he was responsible for the IDF strategic planning and policy formulation, military diplomacy, and international cooperation. He previously also served as the head of regional strategy department, the senior intelligence officer in the IDF's Northern Command, where he was my commander, and other key intelligence positions. In his last assignment, General Yavne dealt with the political military issues concerning the different Middle Eastern areas inside the IDF, and particular participated in discussions with the regional and international players at the military intelligence communities, foreign affairs, and NSC level. So Ram, I'm really honored that you were with us today.
Hi, nice to be here.
So what are we talking about? Between Israel and Lebanon, there are actually few border disputes, either in the maritime area or in the land. As far as Israel is concerned, we have redrawn until the last inch of any Lebanese territory. We have no business in holding Lebanese land, but the Lebanese, during the past 20 years since the Israeli withdrawn from Lebanon in May 2000, actually didn't accept the UN announcement that Israel had withdrawn to the blue line, and preserved these disputes either in the sea or in the land. This was also, of course, the interest of Hezbollah. So I want to start with you, as part of your position in the army, you were involved in these negotiations between Israel and Lebanon, and in the American efforts to moderate between us until 2019. Can you share with us a little bit, how does that work? How does these negotiations work, and why they were stuck for so many years?
So the first answer, and the real one, is the fact that Lebanon never gave any offer in response to the Israeli one. Israel gave an offer years ago, which was very generous to the Lebanese side, which said something like 2 to 5 parts of the disputed area would be Israeli, and the other 3 parts of 5 out of 5 would be a Lebanese one, something like. And gave it to 2013-14, and from then on there was no answer from the Lebanese side, not any formal answer. So there were some talks and stuff like that, Nabi Berri in many cases, and few others, but the real issue was that Lebanon, like in many other issues, couldn't gather any formal policy or real answer to that suggestion, and different mediators from the American side couldn't get and continuous act with that manner. And because there was no Lebanese formal position, the Israeli suggestion was somewhere, but not more than that, not a real process. And at the last year, the main issue was that even about the procedures, where it will be, who will be the sponsor of that kind of negotiations. The Lebanese wanted mostly the UN or UNIFIL as a UN as a sponsor, and UNIFIL as a place, UNIFIL headquarters as a place, and Israel mostly in US to some extent, wanted them to lead that subject. So it wasn't very, mainly, at if I may say so, the main problem was at the Lebanese side, and to some extent it was on issues of procedures, but not more than that. So a real discussion over, maps and real negotiations were not happening for years over that subject. I can't hear you.
Interesting. So Miri, why do you think eventually at this timing, the Lebanese decided to renew the negotiations?
All right, I had to bring this map behind me because over one shoulder, you can see Lebanon and Syria. Over the other shoulder, you can see those Gulf countries. I think many of you are aware that today there was for the first time a commercial flight from those Gulf countries to thus Israel, us right plop in the middle. The Middle East is going through some dramatic changes. These are changes that have to do not with Israel-Lebanon, Israel-Lebanon, Hezbollah, Israel-Lebanon, Hezbollah, Syria, Iran. You suddenly, it's like, what is everything here always so complex? I don't know to say that it's always so complex, but I think that the timing right now is a combination of this changing Middle East, where you have had real actions that have taken place with the Emirates, with Bahrain, but with side effects flying over Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is a player in Lebanon. That's one aspect, it's the Middle East. And the second aspect of specific timings, yes, ladies and gentlemen from all over the world who are listening to me, don't pelt the tomatoes on me, but yes, it does have to do with politics also, because US politics right now, actions that are happening there right now in October, 2 weeks before a US election, most definitely impact some portions. And I have no doubt whatsoever that these are also connected to that. It doesn't make them bad or wrong, but you asked about the timing, and I think that it's that timing coming together.
Interesting. What about the economic? I'm surprised that you didn't mention the economic situation in Lebanon, the blast, the gas potential as well.
I don't think that specifically the Maritime line, which is something that had been out there, as Alma was saying before, it's been out and about as an issue for a long time, or even the economy for sure is connected, but these are all things that are going to impact the country called Lebanon. But the specific timing of being able to do it in 2020, to me, is also because Lebanon is not alone. There are other countries that have changed and moved, that you can take actions, and especially Lebanon, which is such a complex country with all of its different ethnicities, the way that that government is built, the challenges of the Middle East right now that come out in Lebanon in a specific level actually assist the timing of right now. They have no economy, and the gas is not going to resolve that, but it could be of assistance.
So I would love to hear your opinion. Many people say that this is a win-win situation. Is this a win-win situation? What are the risks of this developing agreement?
First of all, if I may say just one sentence about your last question, I think that it's connected to the whole situation of Lebanon. The fact that the Lebanese economy and system in a collapse for about 2 years, more than before even, and they can't see any real future because the main sectors that Lebanon had been relying on became more and more problematic over the years of the Syrian civil war, and because less of tourism, specifically the COVID-19, and then the all other issues that made Lebanon, the financial crisis and so on, that made Lebanon in real bad situation, and the sanctions over Hezbollah, which affects Lebanon as well. All of that together gives almost no future to the Lebanese economy. So they're trying, to do something. So it was on the table all the time, but, now we're speaking about points, in the gathering of points that made the decision a bit to change the decision when you look before. So I think that it's a combination of situation in Lebanon, the situation in the Middle East as a whole, but in Lebanon specifically, the lack of real future, as much as the Lebanese can see that, and the need of the politicians, which are in problematic situation right now in Lebanon, all the politicians right now, to show something, some movement somewhere, because World Bank and the IMF don't give them something. From Syria, of course, nothing. From the Arab world as well. From the US, nothing. So only sanctions. So they have maybe to even show something that can go forward. So that's about that. About win-win, look, if we were coming directly from Mars, probably we would say that this is a win-win, because it gives both Israel and Lebanon to develop gas reservoirs at the border area, and even to cooperate over that, and cooperate with states at the area to the network that right now is being building between Egypt, Cyprus, and Israel towards Europe. And all of that sounds very, very good. But it should be win-win when speaking about, specifically in Lebanon, about the public in Lebanon, most of it, and the economy of Lebanon. By the way, we did, when I've been in my last job at the military, we did work with some experts to the subject, and we estimated at that time that if Lebanon would drill the whole potential that they said at that time, it can bring about $14 billion over time to the Lebanese economy, and change it all electricity, and more than electricity, industrial infrastructure, more lean on gas. Okay, so it can change dramatically. It can change more dramatically than many other sectors, the situation of Lebanon. So win, yeah, for the Lebanese public, for some of their politicians, to the Lebanese industry, to the Lebanese economy. Who can lose from it? Of course, the ones that don't want, first of all, Lebanon to cooperate with Israel. Now, the first I would speak about Hezbollah, which would like to keep some fire, if I call it that way, or some agony between Israel and them, or some rival between Israel and them. And second, I wouldn't underestimate the fact that for many Lebanese, Israel, the question of Israel is not so simple. Okay, Israel, in their eyes, attacked Lebanon over years. There is a Palestinian issue. There are many Palestinians in Lebanon. I wouldn't say that a lot of Lebanese are really big fans of Israel. Of course, there are others, but they remember some acts of Israel inside Lebanon. So it's not very easy to do that. So I would say that, first of all, Hezbollah is a loser, can lose from it because of two things. First of all, other can gather revenues from it. And second, it can make assets in Lebanon, which will be very problematic in wartime. Okay, if you have some drills, gas drills, very close to Israel, and if Israel is doing something against it, suddenly the Lebanese economy get a huge damage. This is problematic. So if you're thinking more economically, but when you try to look at it politically and at the eyes of Hezbollah specifically, I would say that they can be the losers.
So I must say that I probably hold an unpopular opinion because I think that Hezbollah may gain out of this maritime border agreement, if there will be an agreement eventually, because more money will be flowed into Lebanon, and more money to Lebanon means more money to Hezbollah. And it will just contradict the current trend that says no money is getting in until the Lebanese government will change its course. So that's my view. This is what I wrote in my piece about this issue. And it's interesting to see that each of us has a completely different point of view about that.
Miri, can I step in for a minute?
Sure.
You see, that's one of those funny things, is it's about the question that's asked. I don't think there is such a thing as win-win, but I also don't think there's such a thing as, there are lose-lose, sadly. But the fact that it isn't win-win, I don't want to do a double negative here. I think that you can have things that are not win-win and they're still worthwhile. They make changes. I don't think that all of the income that comes to Lebanon, Sarit, goes to Hezbollah. I think that this collapse of the Lebanese economy and the financial collapse of the last 2 years is bad for that part of Lebanon that's not Hezbollah. And Hezbollah has its own issues, both being supported by Iran and everything else going on. So, as I say, it's about that premise of the question. I think that for Israel, if I look at it from an Israeli point of view, we benefit when we are again recognized in an official position in Israel with outer players. When the United Nations comes to the table, together with Lebanese who come to the table, together with Israelis, we win. If we manage to arrive at a line that the international community will agree to, and Hezbollah won't like, but Lebanon will agree to, we win. The international community overwhelmingly has put Hezbollah on the side. Now, I'm with you. Hezbollah is a huge issue. They managed to control and do, but it doesn't mean that it has to be one way or the other.
So I would just, sum it up with my last sentence. I hope that in order to preserve this win, or win for us at least, eventually we are Israelis, somebody needs to make sure that the money would not go to Hezbollah. All these profits of, you mentioned billions of dollars. Miri, so how is this going to end? It's just the opening of negotiations. Are we actually going to end up with an agreement, and who is going to compromise, to your opinion?
Sarit, Zahavi, we're in Alma, and I've been on the board, and we don't talk about the other ones that are over this side of my shoulder, right? Because that's on the other side. How many of us Israelis, I will go so far as to say, were flabbergasted, a word I love using, over the agreements that Israel signed today with Bahrain and in the last few weeks with the United Arab Emirates. Meaning you can arrive at agreements at places that you don't expect. It's kind of, as Ram said before, if you were from Mars. We're not from Mars. And because we're from here, I'm going to be very Israeli and very me and say anything that can go wrong will. And that still doesn't mean we won't arrive at an agreement. Israel and Lebanon over all of, can you hear me better now? I'm sorry, I don't know what's wrong with my microphone today. It's very much me, but I apologize. Can you still not hear me? God,
I can hear you perfectly. I don't know.
Okay, because somebody keeps writing that they can't hear me. And at the end, I'll be like in my computer so that you can hear me. I apologize. But where was I? I lost my sense.
So you said that somebody will have to compromise.
When we talk about agreements in the Middle East and different sides having to compromise, it goes back to the fact that arriving at an agreement does not necessarily mean win-win. I've been in the northern arena for most of my adult life. And I say that because the United Nations has been involved for many years with trying to arrive at an agreement between Israel and Lebanon on the land border. And that the challenges there should be easier. It's a border that was actually marked in the 1920s, even if it wasn't Israel and Lebanon then, it was the French and the British. And I say that in the background because to arrive at that agreement, you have to make compromises. There is no line, and I think it's a question that came up before in the chat, there is no line that the sides agree on, even on the disputed line. Everybody draws different lines. The French and the British use different maps. In maritime laws, okay, there's a whole question over the law of maritime areas, over how far from the border. There isn't even an international agreement on that. So with all of that around us, I think that the moon is in the sky right now, where it behooves the leadership in Lebanon to come to the table, not including Hezbollah, but the leadership. And they're there. That does not mean we will arrive at an agreement.
Okay, so I want to take the advantage of this forum and to say a few words about the disputes in the land border, because I guess that, you know, I'm being asked many times, how come until today there is no peace between Israel and Lebanon? We have signed a peace agreement in 1983, but actually there is no peace between the two countries, and we still have border disputes. Ram, if you can address this a little bit and tell us from your experience, what are these border disputes and how they were addressed in the past years in these negotiations between Israel and Lebanon?
Okay, so generally speaking, I would say that, again, if I would be an external person, I would say that the point of controversy are so small that it's really almost not an issue to get into an agreement. When speaking the territorial side of it, we're speaking about really 2 or 3 main areas. The Maritime one we spoke. The second one is the village of Rajar, which is an Alawite village, which is today of citizens of Israel today, which were part of Syria before '67 war. Part of the village over the years came into the Lebanese territory, but most of it in the ex-Syrian, today Israeli territory. So this is an issue because of the decision in 2000 to make the border in between the 2 parts of the village. And the last area, which was absolutely approved by the UN, but not by the Lebanese, was the area that they call Shaba Farms. I mean, the area of the Hermon Ridge, where they claim, the Lebanese, that this is part of Lebanon, although in different maps between Lebanon and Syria, before '67, it was absolutely a Syrian territory. So on those areas, there are some problems, and there are very, very tactical problems in some other places. Generally speaking, it's very easy, really, to solve it if there would be a will mostly from the Lebanese side. I think we solved some during the building of the new obstacle at the northern border of Israel. But the problems of Rajar and the problem at the Hermon Ridge, I mean the Shaba Farm, is a bit more. I would claim here, as much as I can predict it, that if Lebanon would even sign a real intention to speak over that seriously, I think that progress can be made really easily. But we are not in that situation, mostly because of the blocks, I would call it that way, or the attitude of Lebanon as a state because of Hezbollah, but not only. You know, as I told you, Lebanon is still remembering, in many ways, the Israeli occupation of southern Lebanon before that, '82, and during those years, and all that issue is still living to some extent at the Lebanese publicity. So it's not so easy, but things are changing in the area, and maybe if some regional atmosphere would be changing, would be more and more, would be encouraged to more cooperation with Israel, I wouldn't put that out of order. Yeah, maybe it can come, but not tomorrow.
Interesting. Miri, I'm sure that you would want to add a few words about this land disputes between Israel and Lebanon.
One of the amazing things about the map behind my head, the reason I just love having it there, is that literally all of the lines that you can see, the red lines in and around the Middle East, were defined by outer powers, meaning not the people of the Middle East, not the countries of the Middle East in 2020. And I would even go so far in that sense by, and everybody again, swallow hard, I'm saying something on purpose, Western, colonial, imperial powers. And in that sense, the physical line between Israel and Lebanon is a line that was defined very, very clearly between the French and the British. What I like about that line is that they walked the walk, they talked the talk, they physically walked the line, they put symbols on the line. And in 2000, just 20 years ago, when the United Nations gave us the stamp of approval, when we realigned on the Israeli-Lebanese border after the 18 years that Alma was alluding to, that we sat physically, we don't like using that word of occupying Lebanon, but we sat there, you know, that's the nice different word to saying that. What were we doing when we were sitting there? But when we realign the United Nations, and if you go into the United Nations force in Lebanon, the interim force in Lebanon, UNIFIL's website, they'll explain to you that not only is the line one that they approved, but that it's based on that line in the 1920s between the French and the British. And that's why, in its own way, the two anomalies that Ram mentioned before, both the town of Rajar and Shaba Farms, they're actually not between Israel and Lebanon, they're between Lebanon and Syria. And who wants to open up that can of worms? And so suddenly when you're talking about Israel-Lebanon, it's not just Israel-Lebanon, it's Israel-Lebanon, Syria. Lebanon and Syria never did the walk and talk the talk border that I mentioned about Israel and Lebanon, again, because it was both of those. Lebanon and Syria were both under the Syrian mandate. They didn't define, they drew a line, but they didn't walk the walk, put down those very blue markers, which you see when you go up to the Israeli-Lebanese border. I don't have any expectations there. When I served in the Israeli Prime Minister's office in the immediate during and in the aftermath of the Second Lebanon War, one of the main issues at the time was to go and have a very quiet United Nations little, get together. They went and they checked the issues that were mentioned right now, both Rajal, but overwhelmingly the Shaba Farms. And that is deep inside some committee's paper. Nobody wants to bring it out, which makes me wonder what's in it. What's the hot potato that's gonna, surprise everybody? Because I agree with Ram. I don't expect to be surprised Shaba Farms would be given to Syria. What does Hezbollah do then? And with Rajar, you got to make decisions. We have an Israeli citizens who are living on Lebanese land. So that would be part of the compromises. But I think that those are the sort of things where, just think about it. We're talking about the maritime line, and then you get to the land line, and you talk about Israel-Lebanon, and suddenly I'm going back to the French and the British, but I can't ignore it. Here we are, 100 years after, almost 99 years after Newcomb and Paulet walk the walk, talk the talk, and we're talking about that line.
Unbelievable. Definitely unbelievable. So I want to move on to the Q&A. We have some interesting questions here. The first question I think should go to Ram. Who's the speaker? We are negotiating somebody, but there is no government in Lebanon now. You mentioned the various ethnicities. Who are we speaking with?
So first of all, about this negotiation, we're speaking about the Lebanese side is only the military one. Okay, about the maritime line. They have president. They have a lot of problems in the government. So I would assume that they wouldn't have any progress really soon about any issue because of the deep crisis in Lebanon. I would say that generally about Lebanon and specifically to the maritime line. I think that if something had been changed, and we have to look and see, if nothing had changed, I absolutely agree with everyone that said nothing would happen. Okay, generally speaking, at the near future at least, and most probably that will be the situation. But I wouldn't underestimate or take absolutely out of our scope the possibility that the Lebanese, and now I'm speaking about many kinds of Lebanese, but some of them at least, and even at the leadership, understood two things. First of all, understanding in this time. The first one is that the situation really changed for Lebanon. Okay, Lebanon had few waves of history, let's call it that way, but the last decade was very, very hard to Lebanon and really collapsed the situation, the basic facts of the living in Lebanon. 1 million, maybe 1.5 million Syrians inside Lebanon. The block over Lebanon from the Syrian side, and of course from the Israeli side, because there are no connections. So they have the sea, but that's the only one. The collapse of the economy, but not only the economy, the life, the civilian life of Lebanon. All of that side by side with the fact of the Arab Spring upheaval, let's call it the last decade in the area as a whole, and the fact that in some places, some leaders understood that the future wouldn't be better, maybe, and maybe cooperation with Israel can make some benefit to them. For example, UAE and Bahrain these days, and maybe some other in the very near future. It came because of the big picture. Now, Lebanon, as I told you, have many restrictions in getting along with Israel. I understand that as I spoke with them about that. But to the, maybe not the very, very near, but to the mid-time and maybe on, I think we'll have to be cautious to the understanding that the Lebanese side, because of the basic changes of the situation. And here, I think that the Israeli side also should be very cautious to that and to be maybe active in some places. For example, when speaking about the maritime border, Israel did its act. Okay, we offered, I think, a generous offer to the Lebanese side. So this is a good example for that. But maybe to come and try again, although we had many failures, to try again to make some contacts, because at the end, if they will go to the table, it's solvable easier than almost any other place.
Okay, I must say that when I saw, the renewal of negotiations, and there was an announcement by President Aoun that he is going to be the sponsor from the Lebanese side, since there is no government in Lebanon, and he's also the supreme commander of the army, and these negotiations are being led by the army and less by political level. Again, it doesn't make me happy, because I feel, and again, maybe it's because I'm closer to the border than the two of you, I don't know, but I feel that we are actually negotiating with Hezbollah. There is no government in Lebanon. Hezbollah is getting stronger in Lebanon. The president is the one who made an alliance. The president himself is the one who made an alliance with Hezbollah in 2006. So the question of who are we speaking with is a big question. I personally believe that these negotiations were approved by Hezbollah because of the difficulties of Lebanon, and it became like a shared interest of everybody. But again, I would be much more happier if I would see representatives of the Lebanese government, of the Prime Minister's office or the Foreign Office or Defense Office, in these negotiations rather than the presidency. There was another question, Miri, I'm sure you can address that, about the 7 villages, which is like a dispute that Nasrallah brings again and again and again. And if you can just explain to all of us, what does this mean, 7 villages issue?
I promised to explain the 7 issues, but I'm going to use the map behind my head again to add in some players that have to do with the negotiations and the lack of government in Lebanon. Lebanon has never been an isolated Arabic Middle Eastern country. Lebanon, as opposed to, let's say, Saudi Arabia, huge behind my head, Saudi Arabia self-isolated in their own way. Oman, over my shoulder, doesn't do a lot within the Middle East. Lebanon is part of the Middle East, but look at the map, people, behind my head. It's very near to Cyprus. Along that Eastern Mediterranean shore, you're looking at Egypt, at Israel, at Cyprus, at Lebanon, at Syria, just seeing the tippy tip of Turkey, which is also an issue. And I'm saying that again, it's not just the one side of my head and arriving at agreements with these Gulf countries, it's also the other side of my head and what's happening in the Eastern Mediterranean when it comes to gas. It's a question that comes into that. The 7 villages has nothing to do with that. It has to do with the land border that was defined between 2 mandates, colonial mandates, the French and the British. And when they drew the line in and it was a process, really between 1918 or the end of 17, when the British physically conquered the area, and they already had agreements with the French who were not yet here, the French who arrived, especially to Beirut, especially to Lebanon, where they had very strong alliances. Yes, talking about 100 years ago in World War I. And at the end of World War I, it was literally officers, men, who were the ones who walked the walk, talked the talk, and drew a line. And the men, these officers, Newcomb and Paulet, who met and negotiated, there's a lot of information about the instructions that they received. The French gave the French officer instructions on how to draw the line. The British gave the British officer instructions on what to do with the line. So what is this connected to the 7 villages? When they drew the line at the beginning, it worked out that there were Jewish colonies, that's the term, on the French side, and there were Shiite Methueli, that's the name of the Lebanese Arabic-speaking Shiites, on the British side. And they negotiated about that. And the instructions that were received were all of the Jewish colonies, all of them, have to be in the British Mandate, and that gives us the line of Metula, because Metula was that northernmost little finger sticking out there and so dominant in our map. And the 7 Shiite villages are because 2 were kind of supposed to be on the direct line. And in the instructions, it said, you know, if we're doing that, it's better that it shouldn't be just 2 villages, better to have a more significant number so that they'll actually have a community. And thus, we have 7 Shiite villages. Why is it a problem for Nasrallah? Because there were 6 years from 1918 until the implementation of that line in 1924, 6 years that there was a different line. It was the enemy administration line. It was the occupied territory line. And in those 6 years, the 7 Shiite villages, and by the way, Jewish colonies like Metula, there were several of them at the time. I'm blanking on names, Kfar Giladi and other ones, were in the French side. And in 1924, they were transferred to the British side. And Hassan Nasrallah talks about them. I'm going to give way too much information right now. I'll just say that the only Palestinian refugees who left, fled, were made to leave in 1948, including those 7 villages, because were literally 150,000 Palestinians from the northern part of Israel that ended up in Lebanon. The only Palestinians in Lebanon who have received Lebanese citizenship are the descendants of those 7 villages. So Hassan Nasrallah is playing a double game. They're the only ones who actually got Lebanese citizenship, but he talks about the line and the need to change it. Sorry for my long history lesson.
No, I think this history lesson was extremely important. The bottom line is that this is an excuse for Hezbollah to preserve the conflict between Israel and Lebanon. So Ram, you know, following the discussion about the maritime border, there is a question here. Can Israel really guarantee that the benefits of the gas won't go to Hezbollah?
Yeah, so first of all, it's not a question to Israel, it's a question to the international community and to World Bank and to the IMF or other establishments that are looking at international economy and how to inspect it and look what's happening inside. So the answer, you know, in one word is no, because at the end, some of it can go to Hezbollah's hand. But the truth is that it can be made in different mechanisms, that it will be quite hard to get it into the hands of the military Hezbollah, at least, by different sanctions and stuff like that, and mechanisms and inspection over that. I don't think it would be very easy to take money from the gas drills directly to Hezbollah's hand, mostly because, first of all, the drilling companies are outsiders, are external. These are not Lebanese. Then it goes to the Lebanese, some of it will go to the Lebanese government, and it has to change the electricity infrastructure and other things, industry and stuff like that with that natural gas. Only maybe after that we're speaking about some revenues and how the revenues will go. This is a big story. I don't think that Hezbollah can go, you know, into the Lebanese street government and so on and rob it, and take the money directly into its hands. It's really, it would be hard from the domestic perspective of it and from the outside perspective of it. The other countries wouldn't let it happen. I think at the end, it would be hard for Hezbollah. Some of it can go, but I don't think this is a real revenue for the military side of Hezbollah. By the way, there are questions when we will get to that day that there are working, drilling gas in the Lebanese shore or the Lebanese maritime area, if the production would go even to Lebanon or would go to Cyprus, for example. It can be a calculation of the external companies to do it other ways. So it can be even more complicated than you even asked. At the end, yeah, they can benefit some, but not so much.
Interesting. And following what you said before about the land disputes that can be solved very easily if only Lebanon would want it, there is a question is, do you honestly believe if the issue of the land and border dispute was resolved that Hezbollah would agree to even an uneasy peace, to even a cold peace, what we call it?
If I have to give an answer for today, I would say no, absolutely not. But the real question that we have to look at is how deep is the change inside Lebanon, and how deep is the frustration and fear, I would say that way, of the Lebanese from the future, because that can change things. Okay, we suddenly we see that President Aoun speaks about different kind of governments, and we see the really deep crisis that Lebanon right now is in. And it's a question of what will they do with that situation. They understand that, or the population understands that, and the political leadership, because even if Hezbollah has some other budgetary route and they can have money from Iran, they're in a problem as well. They're really part of the establishment, the corrupt establishment, the problematic establishment. So things are changing. Will it change for good? It's hard to say. And it needs some courage from different politicians in Lebanon, and it connected to the situation in all the area. Okay, if many Arabic countries would make any kind of agreements with Israel, economical, and people will see that it gives some benefits, don't look for tomorrow. Look for, I don't know, a year from now, 2 years from now. Let's say, for example, that even a place that now is in the news, like Sudan, okay, this is a poor country, much less than, or much more poorer than Lebanon. If they will be benefited out of any kind of agreement with Israel, the Lebanese will see that. Okay, and the others will see, not UAE, it's a different league, you know, they are so rich, this is another issue. But if a place which is poorer than Lebanon would benefit something, it maybe can change things. And of course, as long as we don't have any military dispute with Lebanon. And
so actually, you are very optimistic.
Sarit, I have to jump in.
Yeah, before you jump in, just let me phrase the question for you, Miri. Because
but I need to answer the question you asked him before.
It's actually the same question. I just want to rephrase it because, you know, there is a question here, and all of us are former intelligence officers that dealt with evaluations of what is going to happen, what's the probable scenario versus the most dangerous scenario. So exactly, to your point of view, what is the probable scenario?
So I absolutely, in this case, disagree with Ram. My pessimism comes out, and I'm going to say it in the following way. I think that we look at Lebanon and at what was. I look at demography, and I wonder what Lebanon is. I hear the voices. I saw the people coming out over the last year. But just like there is, in totally different way, there's a polarization here in Israel, in places in Europe, or in the United States, inside Lebanon, of all of the countries of the Middle East that are behind me and we can't see. I mean, we can actually see most of the ones that we've spoken about. I worry about where Lebanon goes because of demography. I think that if anybody would go and actually count the people in Lebanon, then they would find the whole structure there of the government, of the different ethnicities, of the representation. And here I'm not talking that, and I'm for Hezbollah, who are standing up for the poor Shiites of Lebanon. Having said that, there's no question that the Shiites of Lebanon are a much larger percentage in any way we look at it than the way that they come. So when we look at Lebanon and we talk about the lack of government and we talk about Aoun, the Maronite, and I'm thinking, how many Maronites are there really in Lebanon that they so dominate the Lebanese, and they're the financial and they're the banks, and we all say, and that's what we want to go to. It's as if, so in my scenarios, I look at the greater Middle East and I am challenged. I don't want to say worried. I'm challenged by the numbers and the demographics. Because I think that next generation, the people under 30, and I hope that there are people under 30 watching us right now, even from the Middle East, right? Okay, but that when they look around them, they may look at a different kind of future. Because to me, the question that I ask about Hezbollah right now and about the next generation of Hezbollah, about the ones who are under 30 in Hezbollah, is that next generation more Shiite, fundamental, Al-Quds, Philistine, destroy the Zionist entity, or are they Lebanese Shiites? I ask it as a question, and I don't know that answer, and that's why I can't give you a probability, because I see the demonstrations and I hear what's going on, and I go, wow, listen to that voice. And then when push comes to shove, I am very disturbed by the way that Shiites look at the world, the Lebanese Shiites. And then I go, why am I disturbed by them? I'm disturbed by the way a lot of Western liberal countries look at Israel right now. So why should I be disturbed about the way that Shiites look at us? I say that a little bit with a sad smile. I am not optimistic when it comes to the future of Lebanon and Israel and agreements.
Wow, fascinating to see these interesting views. I would just respond in a small example. It's always about examples, about almost personal stories. And I will be very careful with what I'm going to say now. In Alma Center, this is the question we ask every morning. This is the question that we want to know what's happening there on the other side of the border. What do people think, and whether the project of indoctrination of Hezbollah truly works. And sadly enough, we see that all these protests and economic and political crisis, and you can add the blast in Beirut, and you can add the outcome of the tribunal regarding Hariri, all of that did not weaken the base of support of Hezbollah in South Lebanon or in the Bekaa Valley. They are still totally on board with Hezbollah. Moreover, you talked about demography. Many people in Lebanon that are not Shiites or that are opponents to Hezbollah are so desperate that they are just leaving. And this is a trend that has been going on since the 80s. And it is back now. And they are saying that to the media outlet. We are leaving. We have nothing to do here anymore. Hezbollah robbed the Lebanese treasury. And that's it. And this is so sad because each time I'm trying, to dig down and to try to understand what is truly happening, I see this despair. I don't see the hope. And I truly try to find it because I want to see Lebanon part of this regional trend that is going on of, benefiting from the processes and the developments with Israel, of the relationship with Israel, rather than becoming part of the Shiite axis. But I don't see the signs for that.
I'm not disagreeing. All I want to say in that sense is that here in the Middle East, that's one of the aspects where it's very challenging to predict. But Sarit, because we can't predict, we still have to have a policy. And I say, and if you don't take the actions that also impact them, for example, trying to define a maritime line so that they could go and do gas, because otherwise we're going to stop them. We won't let them if there is no maritime line there. And I'm saying that we impact this also. And so within my pessimism of that greater demography of where things are going, you said about indoctrination of Hezbollah. And I look around and I'll use the term of education. And I live inside my country and I see people going to school today when they're not supposed to go to school. And I say that because we have challenges all over the place and I don't want to be like them. But what I do want is I want to give that hope that the under 30s that are educated and they're online and they're listening to webinars and they have so much information at their fingertips and they look around and what do they want? I want to hope that, as I said, you know what? I want to hope one thing, but I am very wary because the challenging events of the last 10 years in the Middle East, to me, have not at all disappeared. All that's happened is that they've gone underground and I wonder where they're going to poke up again. What that indoctrination / education / lack of hope for a future will bring that younger generation.
Right. Ram, there is, I think, a last question here that can help us, close the circle of all this fascinating discussion. saying, while the continuation of conflict with Israel is the bottom line goal of Hezbollah, what's the bottom line goal of Israel in these negotiations?
I would say that from the Israeli perspective, as much as we can end any conflict, it will be better for Israel, because specifically with Lebanon, there is no real big price from the Israeli side. And if we can have some connections with them, or even not that, but we wouldn't have any botherness from the defense side, from Lebanon, it will be also important to us. Excuse me about the helicopters if you hear them, because we have some, it's regular, yeah, it's nothing to worry about. Okay, so from the Israeli perspective, first of all, not to be bothered from the defense side. Second, if we can do more, it will be great. Third, for example, at the gas network, if we can cooperate, not directly even, indirectly, through some regional network, it can be important. And at the end, as in Europe after the Second World War, as much as we can have any kind of economical ties, it gives good chances for not fight again, or it take it down. I want to refer just in one sentence to the issue of of the future of the Middle East in the eyes of the youngsters and as a whole, the whole population. The main issue here, and not only in Lebanon, is the question of what would we do with that despair from the situation. One attitude is to sit at home, cry a lot, or leave your country. Okay, that's what's happening these days in many places and that situation. But I'm asking myself what would happen after that. Maybe it will continue for decades, I don't know. Here, as Miri said, I think some action, some thinking, some offers, some doing from not only Israel, from the Western side, because Lebanon, for example, is a quite neglected place. Yeah, okay, they had the blast and they had problems, but there is no real international players that really want to invest in, and the French are doing that, but it's limited. If the US, for example, would invest more in Lebanon, I think the situation can be changed, maybe even dramatically, because of the crisis. If they will do that tomorrow or the next 2 years, I think that they can influence a lot, by the way, in other places as well. So this is the big question. If no one will invest, of course, the bad trends probably, or the not very good trends would continue. So this is the question for Israel and for others as well.
Well, wow, thank you very much to both of you. I was honored to be with you today. Before we wrap, I want to tell everybody who are listening today, if you love our work, you can donate or support us however you like and with whatever you can at Israel-Alma.org/donate. If you enjoyed this session, you can book a private webinar for your own group. We have various educational programs in Alma Center that are adapted to the online times that we are experiencing with the COVID-19. Our full programs are on our website, so you can just take a look and get the impression. Thank you so much, Miri. Thank you so much, Ram. I'm Sarit Zahavi, live from the Galilee, Northern Israel. Shalom. We'll see you next time. Thank you very much.